Hey everyone, welcome to my very first YouTube video. I've been wanting to start a channel for a while now, and I finally decided to just go for it. Today I'm showing you this 1/6 scale resin statue of the Violator in its demon form from Spawn. The sculpt is by B3D Zert, and honestly the pose and detail on this is in par with issue number 136 from 1992. So when I stumbled across this sculpture, it blew my mind. Since this is my first video, I want to be upfront. I had a hard time figuring out how to film the painting process. Angles, lighting, camera placement, it's all new to me. So instead of a full step-by-step painting video, I'm doing more of a showcase and talking through what I did. As I learn more about filming, future videos, I hope, will get better. Alright, before any paint goes on, I've got to clean and prep this beast. Since this is a 3D printed resin statue, there are always a few cleanup steps to make everything look smooth and professional. I'm going to start with a small pick tool to clean out the tight areas. This helps remove leftover supports, tiny bits of resin, and anything that might get in the way of a clean paint job. The Violator has a ton of sharp edges and deep grooves, so this takes a little bit of patience. Next, I'm going to go in with some sandpaper. I'm using a mix of grits depending on the area, rougher for the bigger marks, smoother for the surface details. The goal here is to get rid of the support marks to make the transitions look natural. With the sculpt this detail, sanding is basically going to be a workout. I'm using Vallejo plastic putty, and I'm applying a small amount directly from the nozzle into the gaps and tiny holes. You don't need much, just enough to fill the imperfection. The model has a ton of texture, so I'm focusing on the smoother areas where flaws stand out the most. Now I'm filling the small relief holes with air dry clay. The clay smooths everything out and blends perfectly once it's primed. I just press it in, shape it with my finger, and let it dry. So this part of the base was printed on my FDM printer, and as you can see, the print didn't quite make it. Failed about halfway through. So I had to start a second print to finish the missing section. It's not ideal, but I just rolled with it. Next, I'm sanding the failed edge flat. The goal is to get a clean, even contact point so the new print lines up properly. I'll test fit the second piece, and it doesn't have to be perfect. Next, I'll use super glue to join them, then a thin line of Vallejo plastic putty right along the seam. I'm pushing it into the gap with the tip and feathering the edges so it blends into the print. For adhesive, I use E6000 Premium and Extreme Power Medium CA glue for holding the model together. Alright, now that all the cleanup and prep work is wrapped up, it's finally time for me to prime the model. And for this one, I'm going to try something a little different. Instead of using standard off-the-shelf primer, experimenting with mixing my own. For this mix, I'm using Liquitex Mars Black, a Cretex 4011 reducer, and Folk Art clear primer. I'm going to mix it in a ratio of about 20% Mars Black, 50% 4011 reducer, and 30% clear primer. At first, I wasn't totally sure how this primer was going to behave. Mixing my own primer is always a bit of a gamble, and getting the consistency right took a little tweaking. But once I dialed in the airbrush settings and got it spraying smoothly, honestly, I was surprised. The coverage is super even, the detail stays sharp, and the finish is way smoother than I expected. But the real shock came after it dried. This stuff is durable. I mean, I was expecting something a little fragile since it's a homemade mix, but the coat actually bonds really well. So here I'm fixing another part of the print that didn't quite make it with some Anycubic clear resin. I normally use a baby powder resin mix, but this repair is a lot thicker, and I wasn't confident that the baby powder mix would cure all the way through and it would leave me for resin pie. Here are my colors for the concrete chimneys and smokestacks: Apple Barrel Pavement, Craft Smart Stormy Gray, and Folk Art Steel Gray. All right, now moving on to painting all the concrete chimneys and smokestacks for the base. These pieces are pretty simple, so I'm keeping the process loose and fast. I'm starting the base coat of Apple Barrel Pavement, and honestly, I'm not being precise about it. I'm just slapping the paint on, making sure everything is covered. This layer is all about getting the dark concrete foundation down, so neatness doesn't matter here. My mid-tone, Craftsman Stormy Gray, same approach. Quick, loose, not overthinking it. I'm using a little less paint this time so the darker base still shows through in the recesses. That's going to give the concrete a natural worn look without any extra effort. Now for the highlights. I'm switching to Folk Art Steel Gray and doing a pass in between a loaded brush and a dry brush. This is where the details really pop. After that, I go back in and hit all the sharp edges with the same highlight color. This gives the chimneys a crisp, defined look and makes the sharp edges stand out. Hey, I wanted just a second to say something you probably noticed by now. I'm using a lot of cheap craft paints in this build, Apple Barrel, Folk Art, Craft Smart, all the budget stuff. And I know there are higher quality miniature paints out there. I use those too, but one of my goals with this project was to see just how far I could push these inexpensive paints. I wanted to find out for myself whether I could still get a high quality finish without using expensive model paints. Now, as for these smokestacks here, I'm going to use the same principle as I was for any of the concrete, the base, mid, and highlight. I just like to go around the edges of the top smokestacks to make them pop a little bit more. Now we're going to start with the base. I airbrush on the pavement gray and then move to the midtone of the stormy gray. Now for the highlights, with using the steel gray, I'm going to go around with the dry brush, just a little bit more wet than the dry brush, catch all the edges, get behind the skulls, and then go around, and it's not shown on film, but I'm going to catch all the edges with a smaller detail brush. So I want to show you something that didn't exactly go the way I planned. I was trying to paint the cross where to have a fake marble effect, and I thought I'd try one of those quick tricks I seen online. The idea was to take a dryer sheet or some Halloween spider webbing, stretch it over the surface of the part, and then lightly spray over it with an airbrush. Supposedly, when you peel it off, you're supposed to get this cool veiny marble pattern. Yeah, that's not what happened here. Instead of the marble effect, I got something looks more like random blotches or fuzzy overspray. The pattern didn't even stick the way it was supposed to, and the texture underneath didn't help either. So even though that did not work, I'm still gonna roll with this. It didn't come out looking too bad. It didn't look like marble though. So I'm just gonna go ahead, highlight all my edges with the highlight and move on. Colors used here, sangria red, primary magenta, burnt sienna. For the top hats of the chimneys, I'm just using sangria red. I'm loading up a dry brush with a mix of burnt sienna and primary magenta, and I work it across the bricks. I'm not trying to be super precise here. The dry brush naturally catches the raised texture and leaves the mortar lines dark. It's a quick way to get that rough, realistic brick look. And once that's dry, I'm going back in with the sangria red to pick out random bricks. Not every brick, just a handful here and there. This break up the pattern and makes the wall look more natural, like real brickwork where no two bricks are exactly the same. I paint the tops of the chimney same way I've been painting everything else that has a concrete look to it in this model so far. I'm trying to be as careful as possible with the dry brush for the highlighting of these pieces of concrete without touching the red brick. When I get close to the red brick areas, I'm going to switch over to a smaller, more destroyed brush that can give me a light dry brushing. So here I got really sloppy with the paint. The white smoke at this point, I don't know what I was thinking. I really should have airbrushed this. I had some kind of thought where just slopping it in there was going to make it look good, and it didn't. And this piece was so small, I just continued to make the bad mistakes, bad choices. What am I going to do? Not do them, right? So I decided to do it the right way, use the airbrush, using Createx white. I'm going to be nice and neat, not get it on the cross, just take my time with it. And I do like that a little bit of the black still shows through, kind of gives that smoky quality. Colors here, Liquitex Silver, Liquitex Unbleached Titanium, and Vallejo Wasteland Brown. All right, now moving on to painting all the skulls of the base. For this step, I'm using unbleached titanium and it's thinned down a little bit with a flow improver. I'm being careful not to get any of the titanium in the eye sockets or in the nasal cavities. And now I'm using Wasteland Brown as a contrast paint to give it an aged dirty look and to recess all the cracks and crevices and build up around the eye sockets. All right, now I'm moving on to painting all the chains with Liquitex Silver. I'm just brushing it across all the links, making sure to get good coverage. And at the time, this felt like the right move, but looking back at it now, I definitely feel like I went a little too heavy. And instead of looking like warm metal, it's giving off more of a tinfoil vibe. So before I could start painting the chains around all the skulls of the base, I had to go over with a black to knock back all the wasteland brown that contaminated the chains. The silver was just not covering it all. So after the black was put down, I was finally able to go over with silver, and it's just very careful, try not to get it on the skulls. And very quickly, here's an example of a little versus a lot. And for painting Violator's body, I'm going to be using Stormy Gray and Liquitex White Ink. I'm going to move on to painting Violator's body. The primer I mixed earlier is actually going to be pulling double duty. It's going to be my neutral starting point to build up from. I'm spraying thin down Stormy Gray to create volumetric highlights across all the separate pieces. I'm focusing on the raised areas, the muscles, and anywhere the light would naturally hit. And I'm doing this on every separate part. The Stormy Gray gently lifts the forms. This gives the body a lot more dimension before I even start adding white ink. Taking the highlights a step further by spraying white ink over Stormy Gray I laid down earlier. This is where the volumes on Violator's body really start to pop. I'm spraying white ink straight from the bottle. Since the ink is translucent, it's perfect for controlled highlighting. I'm focusing on the highest points, the tops of the muscles, the ridges, anywhere the light would naturally hit. I'm trying to not blast everything white. I'm just building up the brightness slowly. I'll need a couple of layers to get the intensity I'm after. I'm keeping each pass light and controlled so I don't lose the shading I already built up. Okay, for painting the teeth, the spikes, the horn, the fingernails and toenails, I'm gonna be using this cream color and unbleached titanium again. Moving on to all the horns, fingernails, and toenails on the Violator, I'm starting with the nails, and for those I'm using a cream color. I'm carefully outlining each nail first just to define the shape, and then I'll fill it in. Doing outline first helps keep everything clean and stops the paint from spilling onto the skin. For all the bony spikes and protrusions, I'm using unbleached titanium. Not too white, not too yellow. Same approach here. I outline the edges of each spike before filling them in. It's going to give me way more control. Before moving forward, I wanted to check the lighting on Violator's body actually lining up with the reference I'm using from the comic book cover. So I did a dry fit to see how the highlights and shadow fall. Putting the body in place really helped me out there. The comic cover has some pretty dramatic lighting hitting him in a few areas. I felt my model was not quite bright enough yet. Colors I'm going to be using in the mouth is scarlet red and yellow green. I'm now going to use the airbrush with low pressure and light trigger control to spray the majority of the oral cavity I'm being careful around the edges not to overspray. Painting the horns with unbleached titanium. I'll load the dry brush with paint and knock half of the paint off before touching the model. I'm not going to be aggressive with the brush and let the brush glide over the deep grooves so the grooves will retain their dark color. I keep the dry brush away from where the horns meet the head, and I'll come back in with a smaller brush to outline where the two sections will meet. Now I start painting the teeth, and there's lots of them. I'll use the cream color and mostly start with outlining the base of the tooth before painting the rest of the tooth. The yellow green I'll use for the bow drool dripping in his mouth. I want the drool to be seen around the bases of the teeth and pulled inside the lower jaw. And the stringy drool coming from his top teeth get a couple of coats to build their vibrancy. I'm not too worried about neatness here, seeing drool isn't neat. So if a spot gets unintentionally on a tooth, that's okay. Colors I'm using for the eyes, white not shown, Flow Aid Improver by Liquitex, Pyro Red, and Pyro Orange. Starting with Pyro Red, about 50-50 mix with the Flow Improver to help with not clogging up the optical facets of the eyes. I'm only putting one layer of Pyro down this time. Now with the Pyro Orange for highlighting the eyes. I'm keeping to the outside top and bottom of the eye, trying to make the impression of a reflection. Then I'm going to use a little dab of white for a specular highlight, and I'm going to follow along the orange markings also with the white to help boost the contrast. After that, I've sort of wet blended all together, seeing the paint is still a tad bit wet because of Flow Improver. And after that, I'll come back in with a little bit of white and bring that specular highlight back. Now with a gloss clear coat, I'm gonna go over the eyes, the oral cavity, and the slobber. Make sure everything gets covered real good. I should have hit the eyes with some clear cast resin. Uh, Something I may come back and do again here later. And also, at the end showing the model, you're going to catch a really bad mistake that I had to fix off camera. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and don't be afraid to show your work to the world, because with everybody out there that inspired me, I hope to inspire others also. And now the finished product.